By 2001, Seamus Blackley and his rebellious team of developers had done the impossible. Secretly, the team had put together a game console within Microsoft, a system that was more powerful than any other system on the market, and easy to develop for, thanks to its basis on PC technology. They had won the approval of Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, and Gates had even publicly stumped for the new system at trade shows like GDC and CES. Microsoft was entering the console war. And unlike their time in the computer software market, they were the underdog, going against the established industry giants who had ruled the market for almost 2 decades. This is the story of the Xbox, and in this part, we'll be discussing the launch of the Xbox and the games that defined that launch. The Xbox would spend almost 2 years in development. During that time, Microsoft, gaming, and the world had changed considerably. At the turn of the millennium, Bill Gates stepped down from his role as CEO of Microsoft. He would be replaced by Steve Ballmer in January of 2000. Gates would still serve as chairman of the board for Microsoft, as well as chief software architect. Gates would continue to be the public face for Microsoft as well. Microsoft managed to score a major win in 2001, although at a cost. Since 1998, Microsoft had been under investigation by the United States Department of Justice for monopolistic practices. The Justice Department argued that Microsoft's control over the computer software market violated antitrust laws. A group of decisions were made in court, and Microsoft would escape the wrath of the US government. They were forced to open up their software tools to other developers, but were able to remain as a singular company. The public image of Microsoft was hurt by the lawsuit, which led to a sharp drop in the company's stock price from December of 1999 to December of 2000. The gaming world saw a massive shakeup in 2000 when Sony unleashed the PlayStation 2 on the world. Starting with its launch in Japan in March of 2000, the system was a massive success, more successful than the PlayStation 1 console that preceded it. The PlayStation 2 sold over 6 million units in 2000 alone, and by the end of 2001, Sony had shipped almost 25 million consoles worldwide. Sony's dominance had come at a cost to the gaming world. In early 2001, Sega officially exited the console race. The company's struggling Dreamcast system would be discontinued, and all future Sega projects would be developed for other consoles. Sega had been struggling for the past few years. After projects like the Sega 32X and Sega Saturn, Sega had put everything they had into one final system, the Dreamcast. The console released in Japan in 1998, and the rest of the world received it in 1999. The system was much more powerful than the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64, but Sega's early lead was ruined once the PlayStation 2 launched. Sega didn't just fear the PlayStation 2. They knew their market niche would be eroded with the introduction of Microsoft in the console market, as well as Nintendo's next console, the GameCube. Microsoft even offered to purchase Sega at one point, turning them into a first-party developer for the Xbox, but talks would break down between the two companies. With Sega gone, the console war was shaping up to be a three-way battle between Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft. After CES 2001, Microsoft had a lot of momentum behind them. They had a powerful home console and billions of dollars to support the system. Too bad they squandered that momentum with a disastrous E3 showing in 2001. Hardware issues and technical problems led to an underwhelming conference. Microsoft did have games to show off, including titles from Sega, who publicly committed support for Microsoft. Microsoft revealed the final specs for the console, a launch date, and a price of $299.99. Microsoft also spent a considerable amount of time talking about online play for the new console and the system's built-in Ethernet port. Leading up to the console's launch, Microsoft pumped $500 million into marketing the Xbox. As discussed in a previous series, Microsoft wasn't just trying to promote the Xbox with this ad campaign. A secondary goal was to be the biggest name in gaming, to overshadow Sony and Nintendo leading up to the holiday season. Microsoft's launch plans for America were briefly interrupted by the September 11th terrorist attacks, which put much of the US economy in jeopardy. Microsoft remained steadfast and stuck to their original launch date, although they would end up delaying the Xbox for 1 week to shore up more units for the system's launch. On November 15, 2001, Microsoft launched the Xbox in North America. Microsoft held a launch party at Toys R Us in Times Square, where Bill Gates himself greeted fans and handed over the first Xbox to consumers. The Xbox was, in many ways, ahead of its time. The system supported broadband internet with a built-in Ethernet port at a time when many consumers were still using dial-up internet. The Xbox didn't use memory cards. Instead, it had an 8GB internal hard disk drive for saving games. This same hard drive could be used to store full games and game add-ons, a first for home consoles. The system supported DVD playback, albeit with the purchase of an accessory. The Xbox would launch with 12 games in North America, and quickly sold through its allotted stock. Within 3 weeks, the Xbox sold 1 million units. The Xbox was a success, but a large part of that success fell onto the shoulders of one of 2001's hottest games, Halo Combat Evolved. Halo was a first-person shooter developed by the game studio Bungie. Bungie was founded just 10 years earlier, in 1991, by two students at the University of Chicago, Jason Jones and Alex Saraplin. Jones and Saraplin had become friends over their mutual interest in programming and game development. In 1992, the duo would release their first game, Minotaur: The Labyrinths of Crete, a role-playing game for the Macintosh line of computers. The use of Macintosh computers was an odd choice, given many developers' distaste for Apple's line of products. Bungie preferred the system for two reasons. At the time, Macs were more open to developers compared to operating systems like Windows, and Jones had a familiarity with the system. Bungie would release their first big hit in 1994 with the first-person shooter Marathon. Bungie continued to develop and publish hit titles through the 90s, including sequels to Marathon, known as Marathon 2 and Marathon Infinity, and the very successful strategy game Myth: The Fallen Lords. Bungie's success led the developer to open a second studio in San Jose, California in 1997. The new branch would be known as Bungie West. The new studio began development on an action game called Oni for the PC, Mac, and PlayStation 2. The title would be published by Take-Two Interactive under their 2K Games banner. The main Bungie studio, on the other hand, was hard at work crafting their next big hit. At Macworld 1999, Bungie's new game was revealed to the world by Steve Jobs, then interim CEO of Apple. The game was a third-person shooter called Halo, and it was being developed for Mac and Windows. Just a few months later, in June of 2000, Microsoft announced that they had acquired Bungie for an estimated $30 million. The gaming world was somewhat floored, but the news wasn't shocking to the people at Bungie. Bungie had been looking for a publishing partner since their early days, and knew being bought by a larger company would offer more financial stability. Bungie had also ran into financial problems a few years before the buyout. A glitch was found with copies of Myth 2 shortly before the release of the game. The glitch had the ability to erase the user's entire hard drive, and forced Bungie to issue a mass recall. The title would still be a critical and commercial success, but the recall cost Bungie heavily. Before Microsoft's buyout, Take-Two Interactive had already purchased almost 20% of the company to help alleviate with these issues. Bungie would take Halo and rework it for the Xbox. Oni and the Myth series would become the property of Take-Two. Bungie would move to Bellevue, Washington to be closer to Microsoft's headquarters. Bungie West would finish up their work on Oni in early 2001. The studio would be closed after the game's release, with many of its employees joining the main Bungie team. Halo would see a change in perspective after the buyout. The title would become a first-person shooter, and early impressions of the game were mixed. Critics were unimpressed by Microsoft's demo of the game at E3 2001. Halo would be released alongside the Xbox and quickly became the system's biggest title, overshadowing all of the other launch titles for the system. Critical praise for the final release was incredibly positive. The title would go on to receive multiple Game of the Year awards. The game would sell over 1 million units within 5 months of its release. Around the launch of the Xbox, Halo had as high as a 50% attach rate with every Xbox console sold. It wasn't just hype. Halo offered a large single-player campaign and an incredibly fun multiplayer mode. The title lacked online play, but boasted local multiplayer through a LAN. Halo was the killer app of the Xbox and would go on to sell over 5 million copies, becoming the second best-selling title on the original Xbox. With a successful North American launch behind them, Microsoft set their sights on gaming stronghold, Japan. Sony and Nintendo were both based out of Japan, and their new game consoles had released in the region before their North American launches. Microsoft knew that for the Xbox to be a success, they would need to have a foothold in the region. In order to appeal to Japanese consumers, Microsoft redesigned the Xbox's controller. The first controller was big and bulky. It was styled after PC gamepads as opposed to more traditional controllers, and early impressions turned Japanese consumers away. The new controller was smaller, and Microsoft dubbed it the S controller. The controller was eventually adopted as the main controller for all regions, while the larger Duke controller was abandoned. The Japanese launch occurred on February 22, 2002, 5 months after the GameCube had launched in the region, and almost 2 years since Sony launched the PlayStation 2. The launch lineup was tweaked compared to the North American launch. Notable PS2 ports released with the Xbox included Konami's Silent Hill 2 and Capcom's Onimusha. Sega would release Jet Set Radio Future, a sequel to the Dreamcast original, exclusively on the Xbox. The most notable exclusion from the launch lineup was Halo. In fact, Halo would never release in Japan. Europe and Australia were the final regions to receive the Xbox when the system launched on March 14, 2002. The launch lineup would be a mashup of the North American and Japanese launches, and included Halo. With the Xbox out worldwide, Microsoft turned its attention to its next major plan, connecting all of these Xboxes to the internet. Thank you for watching. This is the second part in a multi-part series about the story of the Xbox. Subscribe to this channel to catch the next episode whenever it comes out next week. You can support this series by liking the video and sharing it on your favorite social media sites. Leave a comment on what you would like to see the story of next, and be sure to check out the previous episode if you haven't already done so. In the next part, we'll be covering the creation and launch of Xbox Live, as well as Microsoft's partnerships with various gaming developers and publishers throughout the early 2000s.